Millionaire abandons girlfriend years later, sees her with quadruplets and wants to take her kids away. But what she does leaves him shocked. Before we begin the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The white wedding gown lay delicately across the young woman's frame, its fabric smooth and pristine, as Claire stood still in the bridal suite. She turned slightly in front of the mirror, adjusting the veil with trembling hands. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, casting a soft glow across her shoulders. The kind of light that once made her believe this day would mark the beginning of something sacred. Her best friend, Emily, stood nearby, trying to steady her voice. "He's probably just making sure everything is perfect for you. Richard's not the kind of man who's late." But Claire knew better. Richard was many things, but careless wasn't one of them, especially not today. Especially not with only minutes left before she walked down that aisle, where hundreds of guests waited. Then came the knock. A soft, hesitant tap. The door creaked open. The priest stepped in, his expression gentle but somber. The room stilled around him as he spoke the words that shattered Claire's world. "I'm so sorry, Miss Claire. Richard isn't coming." Everything went silent. Claire didn't scream. She didn't collapse, not yet. But her breath hitched, her eyes glassed over, and her fingers tightened around the edge of the vanity. Her reflection blurred behind the tears that welled up, smudging her perfectly applied makeup. She rose, slowly, like a ghost moving through water. She walked out the door, down the hallway, past the chapel doors, past the rows of stunned guests. Every stare pierced her like a blade. Every whispered murmur struck harder than the last. Someone reached out to stop her. She pulled away, out into the open air. The cold wind swept through the churchyard, rustling the autumn leaves around her feet. Claire stood there, alone, her wedding dress trailing through dust and dirt. The wind tangled her veil. Her hands shook, her lips quivered. But she made no sound. Across the street, a sleek black car sat quietly. Inside, Richard watched her. His phone lay in his hand, untouched. He had dialed her number 6 times, but his thumb never pressed call. Through the window, he could see the devastation on her face, and it hollowed him. His mother's voice still echoed in his head. "If you marry her, Richard, you lose everything. The inheritance, the family business, everything we built. Walk away now or lose it all." And he chose. He chose silence. He chose fear. He chose the easy way out, at her expense. Claire never saw him there. But even if she had, she wouldn't have looked back. Claire left the city with nothing but a suitcase, a bruised heart, and the silent determination of someone who'd been shattered and still chose to stand. She didn't tell anyone goodbye. Not her friends, not her colleagues. There was nothing left to explain. The woman who had once dreamed of walking down the aisle in white was gone. In her place now stood someone quieter, but stronger. The town she landed in was quiet, tucked between wooded hills and forgotten highways. No one here knew her name, and that was exactly what she needed. She found a room above a small diner. The walls were thin, the mattress sagged in the middle, and the faucet dripped like a ticking clock that never stopped. Still, she made the bed each morning. She showed up early for work and stayed late to earn extra shifts. Then came the nausea, the fatigue, the silence that wrapped around her even tighter when 2 pink lines stared back at her from the tiny plastic test in her bathroom. She was pregnant. She sat on the edge of the tub for hours that night, her hands covering her face, heart thudding in a rhythm she hadn't felt in months. The fear, the disbelief, the sheer weight of the moment threatened to crush her. But it wasn't until the ultrasound that everything changed. The technician smiled nervously, her eyes flicking to the monitor, then to Claire. Claire? I'm seeing 4 heartbeats. Claire blinked, confused. I'm sorry. 4 what? The technician's voice softened. 4 babies. You're having quadruplets. The world tilted. Claire left the clinic in a daze, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. The wind bit at her skin. She sat at a bus stop bench, watching cars go by, her eyes blank. She didn't eat that night. She didn't sleep. But by morning, something inside her had changed. She wasn't just carrying babies. She was carrying purpose. She got up, washed her face, and went to work like nothing had happened. Except everything had. From that day forward, Claire fought for her children, even before they were born. She worked 2 jobs, cleaned houses on weekends, skipped lunch to save a few dollars. She read parenting books under flickering lamps at midnight, learning how to diaper 4 infants, how to feed them, how to survive. The small town began to notice her. The girl with tired eyes and steady hands. The one who never asked for help but never turned down a shift. Her belly grew rapidly, her body ached constantly, but her spirit never bent. Until the day came. Early labor. Too early. In the hospital, the doctor looked her in the eyes and said, "Claire, this is going to be complicated. You need to prepare for every outcome, including the worst." Claire nodded silently. That night, as the machines beeped steadily around her, she took a pen and paper and wrote 4 short letters, 1 to each of her children. They were filled with promises, with love, with hope, and with the fear that she might never get the chance to say these things in person. Then they wheeled her into the operating room. The lights were bright, the air cold, but something stronger than fear pulsed inside her. A love so fierce it silenced everything else. Hours later, cries, 4 cries, one after another, like music, like thunder after a long drought. The nurses wrapped each baby carefully and brought them to her. All boys, tiny, fragile, but alive. Claire held them with trembling arms, her eyes swollen with tears, her heart full to bursting. She had survived. They had survived. No one had held her hand in that delivery room. No one had waited in the hallway with flowers. But 4 hearts had chosen her. And that was enough. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in late spring. The park was alive with laughter, kites drifting in the wind, and the distant melody of a street musician playing an old guitar near the fountain. Claire sat on a checkered blanket beneath a sprawling oak tree, unpacking sandwiches as her 4 boys tore across the grass like a burst of sunlight. They were 5 now, bold, loud, and completely hers. Lucas was the curious one, always asking questions faster than she could answer. Noah, gentle and shy, preferred sitting close and drawing pictures in the dirt. Liam had a laugh that could turn heads, and Oliver, the smallest, had the sharpest eyes. Always watching, always understanding more than he let on. Claire smiled faintly as she watched them, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The past still lived in her bones, but it no longer haunted her. Or so she thought. Across the park, a man was walking his dog, aimlessly at first, until his eyes caught someone, that stopped him in his tracks. Richard. He hadn't planned to come here. He rarely visited this part of town. But fate doesn't knock. It simply opens the door. He froze. There she was. Claire. Her hair a little longer now, her frame thinner, as if life had carved her sharper. Stronger. She hadn't seen him yet. Her back was turned as she knelt to help one of the boys tie his shoe. Then it hit him. The children. 4 of them. 4 boys, laughing, and looking unmistakably like him. The dog's leash slipped slightly from his hand. His breath caught in his chest. For a moment, time bent, the present folding over the past, the wedding day, the look in her eyes, the white dress stained by dirt and tears, the silence. Richard took a step forward, then another. Claire looked up, and their eyes met. It was brief, but everything was said in that silence. He tried to speak. His lips moved, forming her name, unsure and guilty. Claire, but she was already standing. No hesitation, no panic, just cold clarity. She gathered the boys quickly, her voice steady. Lucas, Noah, Liam, Oliver, come here. We're leaving. They groaned in protest, mid-game and breathless with joy, but the edge in her tone stilled them. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. Her children understood her moods like weather. And right now, a storm was coming. Richard stepped closer. Please. I didn't know. Claire turned, her eyes like glass. No, you don't get to say anything now. He stopped. You walked away the day I needed you the most, she continued, her voice low and even. You disappeared without a word, and I learned to live without yours. Richard looked at the children again. His voice cracked. Are they mine? Claire didn't answer right away. She looked at her boys, at the 4 pieces of her heart who'd never once asked why they didn't have a father, because she'd never let them feel the absence. She turned back to him and said simply, What does it matter now? Then she walked away. He stood there, unmoving, watching her retreat, the distance between them, just a few steps, but in truth, it was 5 long years, 5 years of silence, 5 years of pain, 5 years of her rebuilding a life. Without him in it, Richard didn't sleep the night he filed the paperwork. The form sat on the mahogany desk in his apartment, just beneath a framed photo of him and Stella smiling on vacation. A photo that now felt like it belonged to someone else. He signed the last page with a shaking hand. Petition for joint custody. Stella stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with that usual mix of support and calculation. You're doing the right thing, she said. But even Richard couldn't tell if she meant it for the children or for her. Claire received the court summons on a rainy Tuesday. The envelope was damp when she opened it. Her fingers trembled. Her heart sank. 5 years of silence. And now this? She called Amelia that same night. Amelia arrived in a storm coat, her glasses fogged, briefcase in hand. She'd been Claire's friend long before she was her lawyer, back when Claire still believed in happy endings. They sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out between them, 4 juice cups stacked near the sink. He wants shared custody, Claire whispered. After all this time. Amelia didn't flinch. He has money, Claire. He'll use it. He'll dress up his intentions with words like opportunity and future. But we're not going to let that define what's best for your children. Claire nodded, silent. But in her eyes was the quiet fire of someone who had already fought and won battles alone. It wasn't just a custody hearing. It was a stage. Rows of spectators whispered. Reporters lingered near the back. The room buzzed with curiosity, half-truths, and the kind of anticipation only drama can breed. Richard walked in wearing a dark tailored suit. Stella followed, poised, flawless as always. Her heels clicked against the marble floor like a metronome. Claire entered moments later, wearing a modest blue dress. No makeup, no theatrics, just resilience. Her boys didn't come. This wasn't their battle, not today. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, called the room to order. Richard's attorney opened the arguments with a polished monologue on stability, financial resources, access to elite education, the usual weapons of someone who'd never known true sacrifice. He painted a picture of a father reclaiming lost time, a man with means, structure, a better future. Then Amelia stood. Her voice was calm, but every word hit like a stone skipping across still water. My client has raised 4 children alone. No nannies, no family trust, just late nights, early mornings, and a will carved out of heartbreak. She told the story of hospital rooms with no one in the waiting chairs, of birthday cakes made from scratch and school shoes paid for in tips. She showed photos, not staged, not glamorous, but real. Claire asleep on the couch with 2 toddlers on her chest. 4 boys painting cardboard rockets, laughter in the chaos. Money buys comfort, Amelia said, but it doesn't buy bedtime stories whispered through exhaustion. It doesn't buy safety during fevers at 3 a.m. Richard looked away. Stella stared straight ahead, unbothered. Until the courtroom doors opened, the clerk called, "Your Honor, the defense would like to call an unexpected witness, Mrs. Morgan Green." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Claire turned sharply. Richard paled, Stella stiffened. Morgan, the former housekeeper of Richard's family, entered slowly, leaning on a cane, her steps measured but unshakable. Time had curved her spine, but her voice, unbreakable. She was sworn in, then took the stand with a calm gaze that swept across the courtroom. "I worked for the Hargraves family for over 20 years, she began. "I was there the night before the wedding." She looked directly at Richard. "I saw your mother speak to you in the study. Heard her say that if you married Claire, she'd cut you off. You'd lose everything. And you, Richard, you begged her to reconsider." Richard's jaw tightened. His hands balled in his lap. The room went dead silent. Morgan wasn't done. She wasn't alone that night. Her eyes turned. She had Stella with her. Stella shifted in her seat. She was already close to Mrs. Hargraves by then, already suggesting that Claire wasn't a good match, that she wasn't fit for the family name. Now murmurs broke out across the room. Stella's expression cracked, just slightly. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she didn't. She couldn't. The judge slammed the gavel for order. Richard leaned forward, his face pale. "You knew?" he whispered to Stella. "You were part of that?" Stella didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said everything. Court was adjourned for the day, pending further review of Morgan's testimony. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the clouds, but no one noticed. Claire stood by the courthouse steps, clutching her coat. Morgan stepped beside her and gently placed a hand on hers. "You deserved the truth a long time ago," she said. "I'm sorry it took me this long." Claire nodded, her voice caught in her throat. Across the parking lot, Richard stood frozen, and beside him, Stella. Alone now, her heels clicking not in triumph, but in retreat. She wouldn't be in the picture much longer. But her damage had already been done. Richard didn't expect Claire to say yes. Not after 5 years, but she did, reluctantly, cautiously, on her terms. "You can see them," she said, arms crossed, voice steady, "but only with me there. No alone time, no gifts, and the moment I feel it's hurting them, it stops." Richard didn't argue. He simply nodded, grateful for something he knew he didn't deserve. The first visit took place in Claire's backyard. The boys were skeptical, as children often are with strangers who smile too much and speak too softly. Richard sat on the edge of the sandbox, hands in his lap, waiting for an invitation that didn't come. Lucas stared at him with narrowed eyes. Liam whispered, "Is he a new teacher?" Noah stayed close to Claire's side, clutching his sketchpad like a shield. And Oliver, the smallest, simply watched. Quiet. Measuring. Richard didn't push. Instead, he asked if he could help them build the fort they'd started with cardboard boxes and duct tape. It collapsed twice before standing upright. The third time, it held. Day by day, visit by visit, something shifted. Richard learned how to pack 4 different lunchboxes, because Oliver didn't like cheese, and Noah only ate his sandwiches cut into triangles. He learned to braid yarn for crafts and endured Liam's relentless jokes about dad pants. One afternoon, he volunteered to change a diaper for the first time. It went exactly as one might expect. Laughter echoed through the house, and for the first time it wasn't awkward. It was shared. Even Claire smiled. Briefly. Richard was clumsy, yes, but he was trying, and try he did. It started with a cough. Then came the fatigue, the paleness, the way Oliver clutched his chest after running just a few feet. Claire didn't wait. She drove straight to the clinic. Hours passed in fluorescent silence, her hands gripping Oliver's tiny fingers as nurses and machines surrounded him. Finally, the doctor sat down. "Your son has a congenital heart condition. It's serious, but treatable. He'll need surgery. Soon." The world slowed. Claire blinked back tears, nodded, and asked for the cost. The number, even whispered, made her stomach turn. Back home, Claire pulled out a small metal box hidden in the closet. Inside were emergency savings, a few heirlooms she could pawn, and a list of debts that had never quite gone away. She didn't call Richard. She wouldn't. This was her fight, like all the others had been. But Richard found out. A nurse at the hospital, unaware of the tension, casually mentioned his son's chart during one of his visits. Richard drove to Claire's house that night, faster than he should have, anger and fear battling in his chest. When she opened the door, he didn't ask for permission. "I want to pay for everything," he said. "The surgery, recovery, follow-ups, all of it." Claire stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. "No." Richard blinked. "What do you mean, no? You think 5 years of absence can be wiped clean with a check?" Her voice didn't rise, but it cut clean. "I've stayed up with them through fevers and nightmares. I've worked double shifts just to afford their shoes. I taught them to walk, to read, to be brave when they were scared. You weren't there." Richard stepped back, guilt spreading like a bruise. "I'm here now," he said quietly. "And I want to help." Claire sighed, looking away. "I don't need your money, Richard. I need you to show up, not just when it's convenient, not just when it's dramatic." That night, Richard didn't write a check. He showed up the next morning with breakfast. He sat beside Oliver during every hospital visit, helped him practice deep breaths with silly songs. He brought puzzles, read bedtime stories, slept in the plastic chair beside the hospital bed, his hand resting on Oliver's tiny foot all night long. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He gave presents instead. And slowly, piece by piece, that began to matter more than any apology ever could. Richard no longer wore designer suits. He had traded silk ties for flannel shirts, boardrooms for roofing jobs, late-night parties for early shifts in construction yards. Calluses bloomed across his palms like pennants. Sweat soaked his collar by noon. But he never complained. He was building more than houses. He was rebuilding himself. His mother, once his fiercest influence, refused to even take his calls now. "I warned you, Richard. That woman would ruin your life," she said before hanging up for the last time. But Richard didn't chase her. He no longer chased the life he used to live. Because now, when he returned home at dusk, dirt under his nails and muscles aching, he was greeted by 4 wide-eyed boys who actually waited at the window for his car to pull up. Even Claire had begun to see the difference. Not in what he said, but in what he stopped saying. He no longer tried to prove his worth with gifts or promises. He simply showed up and stayed. It had been hours since Oliver was wheeled into surgery. The hallway lights buzzed above Richard's head. The coffee in his hand had gone cold long ago. He sat hunched outside the operating room, elbows on knees, eyes vacant. Then the breakdown came. Slow, silent, then all at once, he buried his face in his hands, shoulders trembling. A whisper slipped out. "God, don't take him from me, please." His voice cracked in the stillness. "I've already lost so much, I can't lose him too." He didn't know Claire had returned. She'd left her scarf in Oliver's room and came back alone. She froze at the corner of the hallway when she saw him. This man, the one who once disappeared without warning, was now here, completely undone, not performing, not pretending, just broken. For the first time in years, she saw not the boy who ran, but the man who stayed. Weeks passed. Oliver recovered well. He called Richard Mr. Rich for a while, like it was some kind of joke he made up with Liam. But slowly, things began to shift. It was the little things. How Richard remembered Lucas's favorite dinosaur. How he sat for 20 minutes listening to Noah explain a drawing. How he carried Liam on his shoulders during a walk home, even when he was exhausted. One quiet Sunday, as they all sat in the backyard eating grilled cheese, Lucas turned his head mid-bite and said it without thinking. "Daddy, can I have more ketchup?" The table went still. Noah froze. Liam dropped his sandwich. Oliver looked at Claire. Richard stared at Lucas as if he hadn't heard it right. But he had. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Richard's eyes welled. He didn't cry, not quite. But something wet shimmered at the edges, and his lips pressed together like a man holding in something sacred. He simply nodded, rose, and went to the fridge. That night, after the kids went to bed, Claire stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the stars. Richard stepped in quietly, holding a mug of tea. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But between them was a silence no longer filled with blame, only the long, slow sound of forgiveness, beginning. At first it was a whisper, a vague post on a community forum, a question disguised as concern. "Anyone else worried about the single mom with the 4 boys? Heard she used to work at a bar. Heard she dropped out of school. Not exactly a model parent." Then came the headlines. "Single mother with shady past raises eyebrows at local school." Photos taken without permission. Quotes twisted. Context erased. The internet didn't care that Claire had survived childbirth with 4 infants alone, that she'd worked nights to pay for diapers, that she had built a home from scratch, using love as her only currency. The online world only needed a few suggestive words and a photo, and it erupted. Claire saw it all unfold in real time. Not from a screen, but from the way the teachers stopped smiling quite so warmly, the way other parents avoided eye contact during pickup, the way one of the boys came home and asked, "Mommy, what's a bad mom?" She held her composure until the kids went to bed. Then she cried. Quiet, shaking sobs at the kitchen sink, her back to the door, shoulders curled as if trying to make herself smaller than the shame someone else had thrown on her. At the same time, across town, Stella sat in her apartment, wine in hand, eyes scanning the reactions online. She didn't smile. Not this time. This wasn't about pleasure, it was about power. Claire had taken something she believed was hers, Richard's loyalty, so now she'd take what mattered most to Claire. Her name. 2 days later, Claire was called to the school for a meeting. They said it was routine. It wasn't. She sat across from 2 administrators and a school counselor, all of whom shifted in their chairs, avoided eye contact, and used words like concerns, reputation, and environmental stability. Claire sat still. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply listened, her jaw tight, her hands folded in her lap. Then, quietly, she said, "You know nothing about my home," and left. That evening, Richard found her outside the house, staring blankly at the backyard fence while the boys played inside. He hadn't seen her look like that in a long time, not even during Oliver's surgery. "What happened?" he asked. Claire told him, all of it. She didn't soften the edges. When she finished, he stood in silence, his hands clenched. Then he walked inside, grabbed his jacket, and left without a word. The next morning, the news cycle flipped. Businessman Richard Hargraves breaks silence. "Claire is the strongest person I know. She raised 4 children alone. She is not unstable. She is a warrior." Richard Hargraves defends ex-fiancée in online firestorm. The photo they used was of him standing outside the school gates, flanked by reporters, eyes blazing. "I made mistakes," he told the press, "but Claire didn't. She gave everything she had to our sons, and anyone who questions her has never seen what real love looks like." That night, for the first time, Claire didn't see the man who once abandoned her. She saw the man who finally, publicly, chose her. Not out of guilt, but out of truth. It came in an envelope the color of time, yellowed at the edges, sealed with wax that had long since cracked. Morgan found it tucked away in the back of an old desk drawer. She wasn't looking for it. It had simply fallen out, as if it knew its time had come. She turned the envelope in her hands and saw the name written on it in delicate cursive. Claire. She brought it to her without ceremony, just 2 women on a quiet porch. Morgan handed it over gently. "She wrote it the week before she passed," she said. "Told me not to give it to you unless I believed you needed it, and were ready." Claire took it with trembling fingers. Her heart slowed, then quickened. She waited until the boys were asleep. Then she sat at the kitchen table where she had written grocery lists and birthday invitations, and now unfolded a final word from the woman who had nearly shattered her life. "Dear Claire, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you'll even want to. But I need you to hear what I never had the courage to say out loud. I wronged you. In the name of control, in the name of pride, in the name of a future I thought I could shape for my son. I saw your love for Richard, and it scared me. It was too strong, too pure. I thought it would take him away from me, from everything I had built, so I tried to destroy it before it could grow roots. But it did, despite me, and in the end, you proved to be the better woman. You didn't need a wedding to be brave. You didn't need a ring to build a family. You walked through fire and never once let it harden your heart. I've watched from afar, through photos, through Morgan's quiet updates, and I see now, you gave Richard and the boys a life I could never have imagined. And for all the pain I caused you, I am sorry. If there is grace left in this world, I hope one day you'll believe I meant this. With regret and with hope, Margaret Hargraves." Claire didn't cry right away. She sat still, the letter trembling in her hands, eyes blurred, breath caught somewhere in her chest. Then, the dam broke, not just tears, but years of swallowed rage, of sleepless nights, of whispered questions into the silence of a room where no one answered. She wept, not for Margaret, not even for Richard, but for the girl she used to be, the one left in a white dress on a church step, wondering what she had done wrong. Now she had her answer. It had never been her fault. When Richard came to pick up the boys the next morning, Claire met him at the porch with tired eyes and a softness he hadn't seen in years. She didn't mention the letter. Not yet. But something had shifted. There was forgiveness in her silence, and peace in the way she said, "Come in, the coffee's fresh." It came in a crisp white envelope with gold lettering on the flap. Claire didn't expect it. She hadn't applied for anything. But there it was. A letter from the American Teaching Foundation, offering her a fully funded short-term parenting and education fellowship abroad. 3 months in Finland. All expenses paid. A chance to learn, to grow, to finally step into the world with something that was hers. Not as a mother, not as someone Richard left behind, but as Claire. The offer was rare, the kind given to a handful of women each year who had overcome extraordinary odds. And Claire had, raising 4 boys alone, rebuilding her life from the ashes of a ruined wedding day, keeping her dignity in the face of gossip, poverty, and heartbreak. She deserved this, didn't she? She sat at the kitchen table that night, the letter beside her untouched dinner. The boys were in bed, the silence of the house pressing in around her like a quiet question. Go, that word pulsed in her mind. Go and start fresh, somewhere new, somewhere far. She could take the boys. The program allowed it. They could learn another language, see snow, ride trams, eat breakfast in glass-walled cafes where no one knew their past. When she told Richard, he didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He didn't guilt her. He simply nodded, eyes calm but heavy. If this is what's best for you, for them, I'll support it. I'll wait, Claire, as long as it takes. There was no accusation in his voice, only quiet surrender. That somehow made it worse. The next day she mentioned it, cautiously, to the boys. She expected excitement, adventure, curiosity. Instead, silence. Then Lucas, always the bold one, crossed his arms and said, "We're not going." Claire blinked. "What do you mean?" Lucas looked at his brothers, then back at her. "If Daddy doesn't go, we're not going either." Noah's chin trembled. Oliver whispered, "We just got him back." Liam, usually the joker, just stared at his plate. Claire didn't speak. Couldn't. The room spun. She had spent so many years protecting them from the pain of their father's absence. And now, they had let him in. Not as a visitor, not as a memory, but as home. That night, Claire sat in bed, the letter open again in her hands. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like a goodbye she wasn't ready for. She thought of the hallway outside the operating room, where Richard once wept like a man afraid of losing more than he could bear. She thought of the nights he stayed to help with math homework, the way he kept a folder of Noah's drawings in his glove box, the way Liam's laughter had changed, lighter, fuller, since Richard returned, and the way Lucas had said, "Daddy," like it had always been that way. Claire folded the letter slowly, then placed it in the drawer. Not because she gave up on herself, but because she realized starting over didn't mean leaving everything behind. Sometimes, beginning again, meant staying. The meadow stretched wide under a blue sky brushed with soft clouds. It was late spring, the kind of day where the breeze felt like an old friend and wildflowers swayed like they were dancing to a song only they could hear. Claire sat on a blanket, watching her boys run barefoot through the tall grass. Laughter echoed across the field. Bright, unburdened. Beside her, Richard sat cross-legged, his hands resting on his knees. Neither of them spoke for a while. Sometimes silence says the most. Then, quietly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Nothing fancy. Worn at the corners, the kind that might once have held cufflinks or an old keepsake. He placed it between them. Claire looked at it, then at him. Richard opened it slowly. Inside was a ring, not brand new, not glittering, not perfect. The band was slightly dented, familiar. It was the same one from years ago, the one he never gave her. But the center stone had been reset, its prongs reforged in gold, stronger than before. He held it between his fingers and took a breath. "It's not a new ring," he said, voice low but steady. "But it's a new promise." Claire said nothing. Her eyes searched his, not for charm, not for romance, but for truth. Richard didn't flinch. "I can't give you the years I took away. I can't erase the hurt. But I can promise this time I won't run. I'm not the same man who left you at that altar." He swallowed hard. "I'm not offering a fairy tale, just a real life. With you. With them." Claire looked down at the ring. It wasn't perfect, neither was he, neither was she, but the life they had built, brick by brick, tear by tear, was more honest than anything she had once dreamed of in white lace. She didn't cry. She didn't make a speech. She simply nodded, a quiet yes, shaped by 5 years of storms and healing. From across the field, the boys noticed something had happened. They ran toward their parents, grass stains on their knees, hands full of dandelions and half-eaten apples. Lucas was the first to ask, "Mommy, are we going to be a real family now?" Claire smiled and pulled all 4 of them into her arms. "We already are," she said. Richard slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit, not like it once had. Better, like it belonged there now. The garden wasn't large, just a patch of green behind the house, bordered by low hedges and lined with fairy lights that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. But to Claire, it was more beautiful than any cathedral, because this time, she wasn't walking alone. There were no flower girls in silk dresses, no tuxedoed groomsmen lining the path. Just the people who mattered. Oliver, the quiet one, held Claire's hand tightly, his chest puffed with pride as he walked her slowly toward the altar. A wooden arch Richard had built himself, covered in wildflowers the boys had picked that morning. Noah, shy but gifted, sat on a small bench with his toy keyboard and played the opening notes of a simple tune, one Claire had sung to them at bedtime since they were babies. Lucas, always the leader, held the rings in a velvet box, gripping it with both hands like a sacred treasure. And Liam, bold, loud, tender, stood before the small crowd and read a poem he had written himself. "This is our house. This is our heart. We were a family from the very start. But now it's true, and all can see. We're not just love. We're unity." The guests laughed softly, wiping tears. Even Morgan, seated in the front row, dabbed her eyes with a pressed handkerchief. Richard waited at the altar. Not in a suit, just a simple white shirt. The same man who had once run from love, now stood still for it. Claire reached him, her hand shaking in his, and they turned to face each other as the wind played gently through the trees above. They exchanged no long vows, only soft promises, no longer built on dreams, but on memories, regrets, forgiveness, and the hard-earned truth of who they had become. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, the garden filled with laughter. The boys chased fireflies with mason jars, their bare feet thudding softly against the grass. The cake was lopsided, half-eaten, the music off-key, but no one cared. Because for once, everything felt whole. Inside the house, on a small wooden table, sat an album. Drawings filled every page, crayon scrawls of a family around a dinner table, a father holding a child's hand, a mother with a bright smile and tired eyes. On the final page, in large, crooked handwriting, were 5 words: "Our family is forever." If you've made it this far, comment "love" to show you're a true fan and that you still believe in healing. What did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another heartfelt story.